The other catastrophe of Blair was, and the other way in which you shifted power from Parliament, was to the law. And I think I would argue this is even more damaging. I mean, you can literally quantify the damage of the quangos I mentioned. There are 400 and odd of them. They control an entire third, more than a third of government expenditure, £500 billion a year, which you and me can do nothing about whatever. So you can quantify that. But I think the unquantifiable, because it's so great damage, is done by Blair's changes to the legal system. Again, that view of Anglo-Britain that I talked about before, there was one supreme body, and it was supreme over everything. Parliament, it controls the church, it incorporates the executive, it incorporates the legislature, it incorporates everything within this idea of the crown in Parliament. In other words, it's the final authority of the sovereign state. As you'll see immediately, the childish analyses of politics, which banned departments of government like that at UCL, and even worse, the Bennett Institute at Cambridge, I'll name names, teach a separation of powers manifestly doesn't apply and never has applied in Britain. But the problem with Blair was he didn't want that necessary correlate of that Parliament is sovereign and supreme. And again, it's really important. We're used to the idea on the left of, Nigel Farage trotting off to Mar-a-Lago, looking at the court, always slightly from the outside, it has to be said, of the court of King Donald, and seeing, for example, Elon Musk doing Doge, and immediately coming back and setting up a Doge in Kent County Council, which is even more of a failure than Doge in DC. But what we forget is the left has been equally obsessed by America, and particularly by the broad constitutional outlines of America, but more particularly by the operations of the Democrat Party. And what Blair and Brown tried to do in many ways was to Americanize the British Constitution. So you create this extraordinary, this nonsensical thing in a country with a sovereign parliament. You create a Supreme Court. Now, it's a deranged idea. It sets inevitable conflict. You got this extraordinary business at the time of Brexit, where the Supreme Court ruled that Boris Johnson broke the law by proroguing Parliament. In other words, a tactical suspension of a parliamentary sitting. Now, this is where me, the historian, comes in. That has been a regular technique for managing Parliament as far back as we can go. For example, prorogation in 1659, 1658, 59 was used to force through the Elizabethan settlement. It's similarly used to force through by the Labour government of 45 the revision to the Parliament Act. Because parliaments have to be managed. If you have a non-manageable parliament, as you do in France at the moment, this entire system of government collapses. But for the Supreme Court, this collection of infinitely learned and infinitely naive lawyers, that wasn't enough. They rule it illegal, and they do, of course, break one of the foundation documents of our constitutional history, the Bill of Rights of 1689. But that's, I think, only the superfluity. What we've got is something much more fundamental, Will. The changes that were carried out under Blair cut at the very heart of the nation legally defined. They cut to the very heart of the idea that government is responsible to its own people. They cut to the very heart of the idea of equality before the law. In other words, this is why, again, I use that term revolutionary. They subvert what had been good about England, Anglo-Britain, in exactly the same way that the French Revolution did in France. And at the heart of the process, and this is, again, where people like you and me have such an extraordinary problem, the left captured language. The left captured words. Because what could be nicer than human rights? Who could possibly oppose human rights? I always say they're like Paddington Bear. It's got little red squidgy pork pie hat on. It's got little so sweetly written traditional brown luggage label around its neck, with per woo, with of course a little lift. It's got a battered leather suitcase, it's a refugee, and you know it. You know, that's what it is. But you know what? They're subversive. They're dangerous. What we forget is when we incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights in 1997-98, it was literally incorporating a cancer.
Yes.
It was a foreign body that has progressively undone the law of England. And we need to understand this. It was a different system. It incorporated a different set of ideas, a different set of values, and that cancer has metastasized.